We're filming this at the Harriet Beecher Stowe house in Hartford, Connecticut, that the phenomenal success of Uncle Tom's Cabin enabled the Stowe family to afford. In March 1851, Harriet Beecher Stowe asked Gamaliel Bailey, the editor of the National Era, a Washington-based anti-slavery weekly, if he would be interested in publishing a serialized story about slavery. Bailey said he was, offered Stowe a $300 advance, and the novel appeared in 41 installations from June 1851 to March 1852. Weeks before the National Era had printed the final installment, a small Boston publisher released a 2-volume edition of the complete work. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 5,000 copies in 2 days, 50,000 in 8 weeks, 300,000 in a year, 1 million copies in 16 months. It has been translated into 37 languages, inspired countless plays, lyrics, and stage shows, a comic opera, and more than 30 anti-Tom responses. Uncle Tom's Cabin entered history as a causal revolutionary force that would eventuate in the Civil War. No wonder Abraham Lincoln, who was commander-in-chief of the violent emancipation her imagination had done so much to urge upon him, had, when he first met Mrs. Stowe during the Civil War, saluted her with, "So this is the little lady who made this big war." But the little lady who produced the most effective written attack on the peculiar institution had little first-hand acquaintance with slavery. Stowe was born in Litchfield, Connecticut in 1811, the daughter of Lyman Beecher, an eminent Congregationalist minister and the sister of Henry Ward Beecher, one of the best-known ministers of the era. At 21, she moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, when her father became president of Lane Theological Seminary. She met and married the biblical scholar Calvin Stowe at Lane. When he was offered a low-paying professorship at Bowdoin in 1850, the family moved to Brunswick, Maine. But if Stowe lacked personal knowledge, what explains Stowe's extraordinary empathy with the sufferings of slaves? Stowe's sensitivity to the bereavement of slave mothers was awakened in 1849 when her 18-month-old child, Charlie, died of cholera. As she sat vigil at her infant's bedside, she witnessed the Calvinist God extract otherwise unimaginable suffering. There were circumstances about his death of such peculiar bitterness, of what might seem almost cruel suffering, that I felt, she wrote, as if I could never be consoled for it, unless it could appear that this crushing of my own heart might enable me to work out some great good to others. After Charlie's death, Stowe began the labor of converting her loss into what she considered a great historical good. That redemptive work began with what literary historian David Reynolds has described as her fixation on Jesus Christ as the humble sufferer, the grand symbol of the burdens borne by the lowliest members of society. It was at the bed of Charlie, she wrote, that I learned what a slave mother may feel when her child is torn away from her. Infant mortality enabled parents in the antebellum era to treat children like Stowe's Charlie and the little Eva of her novel as embodiments of the mystery of God's love. According to Nina Baim, these special children had immense reconciling power in an era when many children did in fact die young. By focusing on the separation of children from parents by death and slavery, Stowe's novelized melodrama transformed the unspent grief of bereaved white middle-class parents into militant tropes shaped by biblical accounts of loss and bondage that she drew from her lived experience of evangelical religion. If child loss partly explains Stowe's empathy, how do we account for the intensity of the public's reception? Part of the answer lies in the novel's capacity to impress its remarkably moving word pictures on the public's moral imagination. Stowe explained the basis of her novel's persuasive power in the letter she wrote Gamaliel Bailey on March 9, 1850. "My vocation is simply that of a painter, and my object will be to hold up in the most lifelike and graphic manner possible slavery, its reverses, changes. There was no arguing with pictures, and everybody is impressed by them, whether they mean to be or not." The content of one of Stowe's most memorable word pictures came to her on the 2nd of March, 1851, while she was sitting in church listening to an anti-slavery sermon by Reverend George E. Adams. When Adams quoted the New Testament phrase, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me," Stowe became gripped by a vision that would become a climactic scene in her still unwritten book. The vision illuminated 4 figures: an elderly slave being whipped to death by 2 fellow slaves who were spurred on by a brutal white man. The man being whipped would become Uncle Tom, the brutal white man, Simon Legree. Determined to bring that vision to life, she rushed home and wrote down all she had imagined. "My heart was bursting with the anguish excited by the cruelty," she wrote, "and injustice our nation was showing to the slave, and praying God to let me do a little and to cause my cry for them to be heard." She may have primarily identified with the bereavements of oppressed slave mothers, but in so doing, Harriet Beecher Stowe demonstrated how an antebellum woman could assume the social responsibilities of preacher, minister, and activist. Stowe said of the book that she had a vocation to preach on paper, just as the men in her family preached in pulpits. Unlike her male relations, Stowe had learned how to fuse the social critique informing secular melodrama with the visionary tropes of the Calvinist sermon. In the melodramatic imagination, literary critic Peter Brooks claimed that melodrama had become the chief means of revealing and rendering operative a truly moral universe in a post-sacred era. But Stowe intended to turn the melodramatic form of Uncle Tom's Cabin into a historical and social force that would bring God back into a secular society from which law had expelled him. There was no God in the society of fugitive slave law. Stowe restored her biblical God's providence in the figures of a charismatic child, little Eva, who had to die in order not to accept society's law, and a slave, Uncle Tom, who felt compelled to displace subjection to that law with submission to God, whose higher law he was thereafter understood to embody. In later years, Harriet Beecher Stowe would say that she did not write her famous novel. God wrote it. I merely wrote his dictation. Can you think of any literary works comparable to Uncle Tom's Cabin in their social, political, and historical consequences?